Welcome to Housing for Huntsvillians, the podcast, a podcast about one couple's quest to eliminate homelessness in Huntsville by August 2026.
Today, we are rejoined by Zach Anderson, attorney at law of Anderson Client Help.
Planning. Yeah, Anderson Client Help is our email address. That's
Every time I get an email from Anderson Client Help, I'm like, oh, right, that's Zach. And you specialize in elder law, and you have come on the podcast before, and we talked about Section 8. But today we're going to talk about something way more, Section 8 is actually very relevant to what we're doing, but I think something that is really important in terms of it impacts a small percentage of people experiencing homelessness, but it looms large in the conversation around homelessness, and that is people who are not able to live on their own. Mm-hmm. So for the vast majority of people experiencing homelessness, simply lowering the cost of housing and like creating more affordable housing is going to solve their problem permanently. There is a percentage of the population who, even with cheaper housing, will still need financial assistance. Mm-hmm. And then there's an even smaller percentage of the population who even financial assistance is not going to be sufficient to enable them to, live and thrive.
Well said.
So, but I think people have a very inaccurate picture of homelessness, because when it comes to unsheltered homelessness, which, homelessness is broken down into like certain categories, but of the population who is living just actually outside, the people who you're going to see as you're just walking around and living life, a disproportionate percentage of those people are going to be experiencing severe mental illness and addiction, right? So there are lots of people who are experiencing homelessness who you'll never know are experiencing homelessness. You'll never encounter them. But of the people you're going to encounter, a lot of them are going to be really suffering. So it's going to give you the impression that a very large percentage of the population experiencing homelessness has severe mental health and addiction issues, which isn't necessarily correct. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So the person yelling at you is experiencing homelessness differently than the person who's sleeping in their car and going to work.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So anyway, the other thing I wanted to talk about is the way that homelessness, severe mental health issues and addiction, and crime intersect.
Ooh, okay.
So I'm sure you heard about Jordan Neely, the Michael Jackson impersonator who was killed in the New York subway by Daniel Penny last year. So I read a really great article from New York Magazine on his life and death, and did an episode about it and talked about how, unfortunately, right now, prisons kind of act as mental institutions in the United States, and how there's an effort to, reduce mass incarceration, which is good. And there's an effort to ensure that we're not mass institutionalizing people who don't need it, which is good. But what ends up happening in a case like Jordan Neely is he was violent, right? He had punched at least 3 people. He kind of cycled in and out of jails, and he was able to avoid jail because a judge sent him to a psychiatric facility, but it was a psychiatric facility that he could leave. And so he left and committed more violence. And he was actually wanted on a warrant at the time of his arrest. At the time of his death. And social workers didn't want to send him to police because they knew he would be incarcerated. What was interesting about it as well is they actually talked to people who had worked with him, and he did better when he was in jail because he was sheltered. He was taking his medication. He was actually better. He was not on drugs when he was incarcerated. So anyway, I also want to talk about, there was a case of a 16-year-old severely autistic boy who beat his classroom assistant unconscious. I think this is another example of someone who like was in a situation where it was not safe for him or others for him to be in a classroom. The medications he was on were clearly not, this was the systemic failure, right? And then the New York Post was covering 5 they called them migrant men who beat up 2 police officers in New York City. And one of them was homeless at the time. And again, it's like, we've talked about, okay, they were migrants, but it's probably more relevant to the situation that he was experiencing homelessness at the time. Because while a landmark report showed that 23% of people experiencing homelessness that they talked to reported having experienced hallucinations, and 1/4 said that they had ever received a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. So there is a larger percentage of people experiencing homelessness have mental illnesses than the general population, but it's bidirectional, right? Homelessness creates more mental illness and addiction. And also, if you are experiencing those problems, you're more likely to fall into homelessness. So anyway, I just kind of wanted to like set the stakes. Like, what are we talking about? Why does this matter? How does this impact people in real life? Before we started talking, and anything you want to add to that before I get into my questions?
Just one quick thing, one phrase that you might hear a couple of times us talk about is the least restrictive alternative. And what that means for each person is going to vary based on their medical diagnosis, their social needs, their medication, where they live is a big one. But the least restrictive alternative is the standard that is used not only in the U.S., but worldwide. The Wingspan National Guardianship Conference, it started in 2001, I believe. They've had further reiterations, embrace this standard. And in the U.S., the U.S. Supreme Court has said that there's 3 things kind of under that standard that we look at. 1, does the person in need of protection, the person with a disability, do they oppose the route, the proposed route? 2, is it the least restrictive alternative? And 3, taking into account the state's resources. And that's going to be a big theme, because even if someone could be a perfect fit for one thing, if there's no money, it's not going to happen. One example in the elder law context, Alabama is one of 4 states in which Medicaid generally does not pay for assisted living facility care. So someone who might be a good fit for that will likely end up in a full-blown nursing home simply because of state resources. That's a reform that many of us would push to change, but that's just a quick example of that. So least restrictive alternative, taking into account state resources, is going to be something we might discuss a little bit.
I think we should discuss all that in detail, because I have so many questions just based off of that. I did not know that there was a national conservatorship conference. That's cool. Where do I begin? Well, so when you say the state resources and Medicaid, so does that mean that either the person is out in the community or they're in a nursing home? There's no other option for somebody experiencing severe mental illness?
Not necessarily. This is a very case-by-case individualized analysis, but it happens, unfortunately, fairly frequently where someone could be a fit for a less restrictive alternative.
Like a halfway house?
Yeah, a halfway house, or if they're just older and have some physical or mental decline, an assisted living residence.
Oh, I see.
And what we end up having to do is we have to, because Medicaid will not pay for assisted living residential care in this state, oftentimes those people have to go into a nursing home where Medicaid will pay. And it actually ends up being more expensive because skilled nursing facilities are more expensive than assisted living residences because they have a higher level of care and they're much more tightly regulated.
Right. Yeah, and that's definitely a theme in homelessness, where we are spending a lot more money on the back end because we refuse to invest in the front end. I mean, just on a very high level, homelessness is extremely expensive for a city. It's way less expensive to help someone avoid homelessness by paying their light bill for a month, or paying their rent for a month, or I don't know, building a lot more housing. But we don't make those investments, and so people fall into homelessness, which ends up costing the city, $50, $100,000 per person per year. So yeah, and it does seem to me like one of the problems that conservatorship runs into is the deinstitutionalization that the United States has gone through, where I think a lot of people really need to be in an institutional setting for long periods of time, in some cases indefinitely, and instead they end up in and out of halfway houses, in prison, on the streets, in places that are much more expensive for them to be, and way less pleasant and way less safe, because we don't have a sufficient number of facilities and beds in the facilities that exist. Is that your understanding?
Yes, that is commensurate with what I've read. Yes.
Okay, so that's just kind of like an overview of that. But going into conservatorship, so I read your materials online, which is great. Those are at your website, which is at
AndersonProtection.com. Lots of free resources there for you.
A lot of really great stuff.
Glad you checked it out.
Yeah, of course. So I was curious about, our power of attorney, guardianship, and conservatorship, do they fall under the umbrella of supported decision-making, or is supported decision-making a fourth alternative?
It's a fourth alternative,
Okay.
but it's very related to those three.
Okay. All right.
So powers of attorney, guardianships, and conservatorships, and supported decision-making are all tools to elect a surrogate decision maker or a surrogate decision helper if you can't make and communicate decisions for yourself. A power of attorney allows a surrogate to simply speak, sign, and act for you if you can't. So does a guardianship and a conservatorship. The supported decision-making is a little bit of a hybrid, and it's a very, very new thing. A majority of states have this now. Alabama expressly recognizes it, which is wonderful to have in the toolbox. It allows someone to pick someone not necessarily as a decision maker. You would do that through a power of attorney, but someone who can help them make and communicate decisions. Oftentimes, this is a close family member, as you might imagine. But the idea is we don't need to, cut all of somebody's decision-making rights off just because, they can't file their tax return or balance a checkbook or manage a bank account. My accountant can tell you we have trouble reconciling the business account. But the point is, somebody even who cannot manage their own financial affairs and assets and debts and things like that, taxes, they can still decide what time they go to bed at night. And they can still decide when they eat, and what they do on a daily basis, what they do for work or fun or what have you.
Sure.
So supported decision-making is kind of a hybrid in there, but they are all closely related.
Okay, awesome. And going back to the least restrictive alternative, this is both me being too literal and me having issues with the status quo, but it seems like that would not be the thing we would optimize. Well, literally the least restrictive, alternative to what, I guess, because this is the issue that I have is obviously what we're trying to do when we talk about supported decision-making, power of attorney, guardianship, institutionalization, we're talking about violating people's rights.
Yes.
And that's something that's obviously not a thing you want to do unless there's a very compelling reason. And frankly, before I moved to San Francisco, I didn't see any situation in which you would want to violate somebody's rights. Maybe if they're a criminal. After moving to San Francisco, I was faced with the reality that sometimes the kinder, better, more humane thing to do is to violate somebody's rights. You know, if people are choosing to deteriorate on the streets, they're choosing to yell and scream. They're not really choosing, right? If they're covered in sores and, you know, no, that's not the right thing to do. So I guess, like, what is that? What does the least restrictive alternative mean?
You're going to love this. Multiple sources of law, including the United States Supreme Court, the National Academy of Elder Law Attorneys Aspirational Standards, the Wingspan Guardianship Conference, the Rules of Professional Conduct for just about every state, which governs the conduct of lawyers. They have all come to the following conclusion that this is the analysis that we go through. First is informed consent. Can the person, being informed of the necessary facts, risks, benefits, alternatives of any proposed action or non-action, can they say, okay, I understand the facts, and based on my own personal opinion, whatever it is, I'm going to say yes, no, maybe, whatever they say. That's informed consent. Well, what if you can't get informed consent? What if someone has a severe mental illness or something like that? The next thing we look at is the doctrine of substituted judgment. So if we have a surrogate decision maker, like a guardian, a conservator, a supported decision making, they're called, what are they called? I'm sorry, I can't remember. It's so new. I haven't done a ton of them. The law became law in August of 2023. Supporters, they're called supporters. The supporter isn't saying, well, what would I do here? Or what's in the best interest of this person? The surrogate decision maker is to put themselves into the shoes of the protected person and say, what would they do based on their goals, their judgments, their values, their lifestyle? You're becoming a surrogate decision maker based on what they would do if they could consent or think about it instead of what you would do. And well, what if we don't have that? That might be the case. Maybe that person didn't write anything down. Maybe their guardian is not their mom. Maybe their parents are dead. Maybe they don't have any siblings. Well, at that point, there's no other alternative, so we go to the best interest standard. That is third in line. That is not the preferred one, but when there's nothing else, that's what we do. And that's kind of the hierarchy the law lays out. And as you might imagine, least restrictive alternative comports with that hierarchy, but a sub kind of extension of that rule is that guardianships and conservatorships, while an important tool in the toolbox, are to be used as a last resort. And I think that maybe comports with your evolution on this issue of maybe guardianships and conservatorships are not inherently bad, but they are to be used as a last resort. You're thinking, tell me your thoughts.
Well, I just think that the two things that are the sticky wickets in this, I mean, there's infinite, but the things that jump out to me is, how do you determine whether someone is capable of sound judgment? And then how do you determine best interest? Like, that's really difficult, because in San Francisco, advocates are walking by people who are yelling at no one and covered in sores and saying, this person is choosing this and we need to respect their decision. So, you know, how is that determined?
Best interest is a lot harder. The line of when someone needs a surrogate decision maker, they cannot make decisions for themselves. I went to the uniform acts that are going to be applicable to most states. Can't guarantee they're valid in all 50, but the most recent uniform acts have the following standards. For guardianship, and just to back up for just 1 second, guardianships and conservatorships do the same thing, but guardianships are toward the person. So think healthcare decisions, working with the hospital staff, talking with doctors about the pros and cons of a certain treatment or surgery. Conservatorships are over the money. Okay, so guardianship is more for healthcare decision making, living arrangements, visitation, marriage, voting rights, things like that. Conservatorships are for, well, they've got $100,000. They're completely incapable of managing it. So let's get someone who has to use it for their benefit to actually stroke the checks and pay the debts and things like that.
Is that true in every state?
The dichotomy between guardianship and conservatorships, if it's not all, it's probably most.
Interesting, because when I was in California, in San Francisco, there was a debate about expanding conservatorship, and that was the word that was used. But it seemed to me, because the whole conversation was really on, like 5 to 12, what they called frequent flyers. So these were people experiencing homelessness that would show up, in jails and ERs over and over again. Mm-hmm. So it sounded to me like what they were actually talking about was guardianship based on this definition, because these people didn't have any money. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I was just curious, but I believe you.
California is an interesting one. I'm not going to go down this rabbit hole too much, but it wouldn't shock me if the terms were different. Attorney confidentiality in this realm is a very, very big topic in this area of law. For example, let's say I'm representing a conservator of Uncle Bill's. It would be technically his estate, even though he's not deceased. Uncle Bill's conservator is Jim. Jim is my client, needs help administering the conservatorship for Uncle Bill's benefit. I discover that Jim has invested some of Uncle Bill's assets into Jim's personal business. The laws require, and I won't go into the weeds on this, the laws require me to take some kind of action, even if it's just talking with Jim and saying, hey, let's have a further discussion. Can you show me some numbers on this? You don't go straight to the court and, try and throw Jim in jail. But I have to take some kind of action. There's one state that has an exception, California. There is no exception unless you get informed consent from your client in California. It's considered an oddity in this realm. Now, attorney-client confidentiality is very, very important, so I'm not saying the rule is ridiculous. That's for everyone to have their own opinion on. But it wouldn't shock me. California's got some oddities.
Couldn't agree more. Okay. So we've got power of attorney, we've got guardianship. So that's really good to know, because I've only been in Alabama for 2 years. I've really only been talking about Alabama politics for 6 months, and so I've been talking about conservatorship. But from now on, I'll be talking about guardianship, because the population that I'm talking about does not have a lot of assets to worry about. We're really trying to make sure that they're taking their meds. Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to follow up on your first part of that question of when is the standard of when someone needs it, even when it's easy to identify. Well, what's the standard? Here's the standard for guardianship from the most recent Uniform Acts. Someone who is unable to receive and evaluate information or make or communicate decisions to the extent that they lack the ability to meet essential requirements for their physical health, safety, or self-care.
Okay. All right. So basically like danger to themselves or others.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Well distilled.
Okay. Awesome. I think that makes sense. And I think the standard is fine. I think the application then is where we're really lacking, in that there are a lot of people who are dangerous to themselves and others who are not being supported. Mm-hmm. Okay. The other question I had was, so right now it sounds like if you are a danger to yourself or others, and right now, frankly, what happens, generally speaking, is you either go to jail or you are put in for like a 48-hour hold in a hospital, in a psych ward. Then you're released, often wearing your bracelet and a freaking hospital gown, and you're just, okay, well, we'll see you again when you have another breakdown and someone calls the cops on you. But somehow, so how does that person then get into, the system where they could be actually assisted in some real way?
As far as whenever I deal with guardianships or conservatorships, we've got someone who has stepped forward to want to fill that role.
Right.
When we have a situation where that's not the case,
right.
I'm not familiar with that at all.
Right.
I do believe there are attorneys in town who do that kind of work, and they're, compensated from the state, I presume, for serving as guardian. But when someone doesn't step forward to petition the court for a guardianship or conservatorship, I just wouldn't have experience in that realm.
Yeah, me neither. So in theory, I guess, like a police officer could say, like, hey, I've picked this person up 3 times. They seem like a danger to themselves, if nothing else. Court, can you intervene?
The statute reads that anyone interested in the person's welfare can petition the court for a guardianship, a modification of the guardianship, a termination of the guardianship if the person's condition has improved. Would a police officer fit that description? I would argue he or she could.
Or even like a neighbor. Like if you live near someone who seems like they're in acute psychiatric distress, you could petition the court?
I would argue you would fit the statute. I think you could make a good argument.
Okay. All right. So if the person, because this is like generally speaking, again, mental illness is not a major cause of homelessness. It's just not. But if you are suffering from severe mental illness, you are more likely to fall into homelessness than someone who isn't, because you're at a disadvantage. People who are at a disadvantage. One thing that's interesting too is that men are actually more likely to fall into homelessness than women. And it's not because men are disadvantaged in society, but it's that there are supports that are available to women that are not available to men, is my understanding. And probably part of that is families' willingness to help. I think probably all else equal, families are more willing to help women for longer than they are men. Again, all else equal. But anyway, the point is, not having family who is able to help you is also a big risk factor for falling into homelessness. And here the housing crisis not only directly leads to homelessness, but it indirectly leads to homelessness in that, at least in California, a greater percentage of people rent, and the housing crisis is worse. And so there's a problem where people are homeless in that they don't have a home, but they can stay with family a few nights a week, let's say. But the families can't let them move in because their landlords will evict them for overcrowding. So anyway... Well, and this is a problem in that if you don't have family at all, which is the case in a lot of cases of people who fall into homelessness, or you have family members who, are barely able to stay in their apartments and certainly don't have the bandwidth to like be your decision maker. So it's never that the court appoints like a social worker or someone. It's always that they act in the best interest of the person, or like, how does that work?
So when someone has been appointed as guardian or conservatorship, yes. And the court or the fiduciary, the guardian or conservator, would have to go through that hierarchy. Informed consent. If not, then substituted judgment. If not, then best interest. Well, we can't get informed consent, right? If we could, we wouldn't have the guardianship or conservatorship. So what's next on the priority list? Substituted judgment. So that's why the statutes provide for a hierarchy of people who will be guardian or conservator. And it starts with spouse gets first priority, adult children get second priority, a parent gets third priority, I believe, and then siblings, and then anyone interested in the person's welfare and has some knowledge about them would be last. Now, the court can skip over someone if it's in the best interest of the person. We don't want an abuser or someone who is themselves incapacitated as the guardian. But that person is going to apply the substituted judgment standard and say, if, Tim is the subject of a conservatorship or guardianship, what would Tim do here? Would Tim want to have a house that's his? Does Tim not really care about that and would rather have the amenities of an apartment or something like that? Doesn't matter what mom or sister or Jim down the street, his neighbor who's guardian, thinks. That's best interest. We do substituted judgment first. Where we do best interest is when we have no idea what substituted judgment would do. We have no idea what Tim would want. He didn't write anything down. He has no family. Nobody really knows him. He doesn't have a lot of friends. Well, then you have to act in the best interest.
That's great. Thank you. I guess I'm curious about who is, like, in the case of Tim doesn't have any friends or family, like, who is the person who is the supporter? The guardian. Who is the guardian? The guardian,
if we go through the hierarchy and there's no one, then it's someone interested in a person's welfare, and they have knowledge of that person, so it could be a neighbor or something like that. And if that's not the case, I've never had an instance like this, but if that's not the case, I imagine one would be appointed by the court and would be some type of attorney or something like that.
An attorney.
I imagine. I say I imagine. I don't deal in that particular realm.
Yeah. Okay. That's good to know. Let me get back to my...
While you're doing that, just a little nugget to what, if you find this realm of law interesting, just a little nugget. One of the changing subtopics of this area is divorce. So we are moving toward, person-centered.
Let me. Yeah. So when you look at the risk factors for homelessness, divorce and death of a spouse are huge.
That's really sad, but I suppose makes sense. When someone is the subject of a guardianship, can the guardian file for divorce from that person's spouse? So let me lay the groundwork, and I'll tell you the answer in just a second. The groundwork is, we're moving from kind of institutionalization as a first stop, guardianship as a first stop, to those things are more of a last resort, person-centered planning, substituted judgment. What would the person do if they could make the decision? So we're moving that direction. And is divorce an exception or is it an application of that? Let me tell you how the states are trending. A majority of states still hold that a guardian cannot file for divorce of the protected person. The trend is changing. The trend is saying guardians can do that. And the idea behind that is the vulnerability for abuse of a spouse who is abusing either financially or emotionally or physically or what have you is so high that risk is so high that the person's rights to marry who they want, stay in a marriage, etc., they get trumped by that extreme danger. That's the thought. The other way to look at it is, hey, this is the person's decision. Nobody appointed by a court ought to be making a decision about who they marry and whether they stay married. That's between the person and their spouse if they wish. And if the person wants to file for divorce, the guardian can help them do that, file the forms, pay a lawyer, whatever. So which is right or wrong, that's up for each individual person to decide, but a very interesting kind of trend in the law there. Yeah, I can tell the gears are working. I'm curious your thoughts.
I'm incensed. One, according to the Body Keeps the Score, physical violence occurs in 1/4 of marriages. So the idea that people are at risk of being abused by their spouse is a vast understatement. Spousal abuse is extremely common. And again, being in any way disadvantaged puts you at far greater likelihood of experiencing abuse in any context, but in marriage included. So that's something to freaking consider. And then the other thing is, it seems wild to me that what we're talking about is control over whether someone takes their psychiatric medications, for example. That's a huge decision. We're talking about like how your brain operates. To think that whether or not you're married to someone is a bigger like deal in terms of autonomy than your psychiatric medications, it makes no sense whatsoever.
That's a great point. There was this issue was explored in depth in a maybe 1 or 2 year old article in the National Academy of Elder Law Attorneys journal, the NALA journal, and that point, as you just phrased it, the author made great points in the article, but that point that you just phrased was not put that way. I think that's a pretty compelling point.
Thank you. It just seems really obvious to me that this is trapping people in marriages status quo bullcrap. Like I don't know.
And I think the tide, again, the states are trending in the direction of allowing the
Which
guardian
is good.
to do it, right? And I think that comports and tracks with, there's a lot more knowledge out there about emotional abuse and how somebody could be, quote unquote, free to walk out the door at any time, but in many ways they're not, especially in the context of someone who has some kind of mental disability.
Right. And this is something that I think is really underestimated, is we understand the potential for abuse. Abuse always comes down to power. You cannot have abuse without power. And obviously, I mean, it's right in the name, power of attorney, right? Guardianship, supported decision making. Like what we're talking about is power. You get to compel someone to do something legally. And obviously, we need to be very concerned about who gets that power, what kind of power, what safeguards are put in place, yada, yada. But the alternative of doing nothing doesn't mean the person is empowered. It means there's no check on who's influencing them. And so right now, the same people who are at risk of being abused by spouses are also at risk of being abused by everyone they come in contact with. And there's no guardian or person in between the person experiencing the disability and the outside world. And again, homelessness is if you are homeless, you do not have a door to lock, and you're experiencing extreme psychiatric distress, you're about as vulnerable as a person could be. And often these people will have physical disabilities as well. And so what I'm advocating for is, let's take a situation that like almost could not be more dangerous and vulnerable and have some kind of at least legal, accountable mechanism in place to protect that person versus the default. You know what I mean?
There are more guardrails in the financial context than there are in the health and personal care context. Conservators have to file an initial report with the court saying, here's within 60 days of appointment, here's what, to the best of my knowledge, Your Honor, here's what the protected person owned, here's their debts, etc. And then yearly after that, they have to report to the court. Did the chart go up, numbers go up, down, what have you. Additionally, they do have to post a bond. It's like an insurance policy against if the conservator did abscond with the ward's money. If you hear me say ward, just a quick note. For the longest time, the person under a guardianship or conservatorship was referred to as the ward. They are now referred to in the most recent statutes, the uniform laws, as the person or the protected person or the individual or something like that. So if you hear ward slip out of the lips of an estate planning or elder law attorney, they're probably acting in good faith. It's a bit like the NFL Washington Commanders and the Redskins. Every now and then you will hear a reporter or something say, the Redskins quarterback, that's how it was for 50 years. We're trying. Okay, so just a quick note on that. I actually can't remember. I think I was just about at the end of my statement, so although I can't remember what it was.
You were saying the person, there are more protections for the financial.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Well, it's like easy.
Go ahead.
I mean, to not be fair, people be following the money. But then to be fair, you can measure a dollar. It's much more difficult to measure is this person on the right meds? Or, is their blood being tested often enough? Are they eating right? These are the kinds of things you would want the guardian to be in charge of. Are they bathing properly? I mean, obviously it's not impossible to measure, but it's harder than dollars and cents.
I should mention one guardrail that is not technically a part of the guardianship code of Alabama or any state, but one thing to note is we do have and have had an evolution of mandatory reporting laws. Mandatory reporters, now this is going to vary by state, but mandatory reporters could be as broad as someone who is a janitor in a nursing home. Believe it or not, in some states could be a mandatory reporter. A mandatory reporter is, in layman's terms, so I try to do everything, is if you see the possibility of abuse, you got to take some kind of action. Report to a supervisor, perhaps report to the police. So you got to be on guard if you're a mandatory reporter. Pastors are sometimes mandatory reporters, attorneys, mandatory reporters, social workers, people in hospital, medical staff might be, but it can go all the way down to someone who's a custodial employee of a nursing home or something like that. Could be a mandatory reporter. So that is one guardrail. Have I ever had to spring that into action? Thankfully, no. So I'm not I guess I'd like to be more educated on it, but thankfully I haven't had to learn that trial by fire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I want to go off on a rabbit trail on mandatory reporting because it's definitely questionable, pros and cons to it. But anyway, that's good. I think, like I said, it's not a perfect system. There's no perfect system, but in a lot of cases, in getting the legal system involved is better than the status quo.
Mm-hmm.
And it's easy to get upset about, this can happen and this has happened in the past. But it's like, okay, but this is happening now.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Mm-hmm. And so many of these issues are so different. I mean, it's never been harder to have a residence for your family.
No.
I mean, when people are working really hard, whatever that means, whether that means going to school for 7 years, whether that means working nights to put themselves or a family member through school, whether that means working extra hours at a plant or a factory at a school or something, when these people are busting their tails and can't afford a residence for their family and maybe want to grow their family but feel like they can't, that has never been a bigger problem than it is today. It's so different, and the laws haven't evolved. With zoning laws, let's take the explicitly racist part out of it, but just a zoning law that says only single family homes, in my neighborhood of South Huntsville. In 1950 that might have been fine. We didn't have that many people. The houses, per average income or what have you, was affordable. If you worked hard, you could generally get it. That doesn't work anymore. Doesn't work in 2023. And I'm not saying we need to kick people out of the country and have less people. But the laws don't work as of now with what we're experiencing, because it's changing so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And when you go to developing nations, I hear poverty is the reason we have homelessness. Well, you go to real impoverished nations, and guess what they don't have? They don't have homelessness. Everyone has a door that locks. So, no, it's not poverty. It's we've had a lot more people move in, and we haven't built homes for them.
It's hard in America to sell because of a variety of reasons. One of them is members of the House are elected on a 2-year basis. It's really hard to not take the easy way out, because the easy way out is to get in front of a microphone and say, these people are a nuisance, they bring nothing to the table, and they just cause trouble. They cause trouble. You can't take your kids out for ice cream. Look, I agree. You ought to be able to take the kids out for ice cream without being yelled at or cursed at. But if that was the answer, I mean, that can't be the answer. I mean, we're not just going to kill people, right? I mean, we have laws against that. The answers are harder. They're not impossible. Mike Tanner outlined them on the podcast, and you, Kathy, have outlined those answers and other answers on other episodes. But it's so easy just to get the sound bite, And I think that's such a big part of the problem. Is it's so easy just to not solve the problem by getting a good little sound bite, instead of actually digging in and asking experts and not taking everything they say, oh yeah, just Mike Tanner, send us the bill, we'll sign it. But listening to what they have to say and thinking about it and either agreeing or disagreeing, but trying to find something other than these people are just a problem and that's going to be the solution, we just got to get them out of here.
Absolutely. So putting them in jail or letting them die on the streets is morally acceptable, but assigning them a guardian or putting them in a mental institution is too harsh. Right? People are appealing to the emotions of what they see as their constituents, where it's either these people are sovereign citizens and we can't do anything to get in their way. We have to just let them make the choices that they're making, ignoring that everyone makes choices in a context, and we've created a context in which they don't have any good options. Or these people are bad people, like you're saying, and we have to punish them into doing right. And if we just make life hard enough for them, then they'll start making better choices. It's like, again, their choices are very constrained. You cannot incarcerate or,
Yeah, what's the end game of that?
Right.
It doesn't solve the problem.
No. And prison is criminogenic, right? We're creating more crime by putting more people in prison. So, yeah, I think it's hard, right? Like, this is complicated. I have been thinking about this for years and reading about it for years, and I don't know the basics. Like, I'm asking you very basic questions because I don't know the answers to these questions. The terminology is difficult. It varies from state to state. It's, the definitions are a little bit, I'm going to say squirrely, but it's complicated. It's difficult. Nuance is hard. Detail is hard. Political bromides are easy. And so I think, unfortunately, this is an issue where it's going to take the people who are impacted, which is everybody. If you're not literally seeing people who are experiencing homelessness, you're paying for homelessness, I guarantee you, through your taxes. And just like, it's just not a thing that you want. And so it's going to take everyone who's impacted to say, hey, these are some solutions that can actually help. You know, your job as an elected official is to create policy that solves problems, and where policy is in place, make sure it's actually being enforced. So we have these mechanisms in Alabama and in Huntsville. They exist. They're clearly not being implemented to the extent that they could be. So who has opportunity to do their job a little more and a little better? You know, we need to find those individuals. We need to write our council people. We need to say, hey, like this severe mental illness, untreated severe mental illness and addiction is a policy choice. Right? We have a mechanism to fix it. We're not using it. Every instance of a person who has severe mental illness and addiction who's not in treatment is a policy failure. Homelessness is a policy choice. Right? And so, like, call your council person and say, yo, dog, like, we have the policies. We need them implemented. Like, this is not acceptable.
One other thing that I would add, and this is going to be a little bit off the grid here, but changing the societal embrace of alcohol might be something that we could do. And if you want to talk about a way to get Republicans on board, Republicans are more likely to be conservative religious evangelicals, and they're more likely to be more conservative about alcohol in terms of views. It is completely, this is my opinion, you're welcome to disagree with it. It is completely unacceptable to me that movies and media and entities like that have a large amount of sway with particularly young people celebrate kids turning 18, going off to college, and basically developing alcoholism. That should not be celebrated. Alcohol abuse should be taboo. Alcohol should certainly not be banned, and you should be free to drink it. But the societal embrace of the party guy and party girl who's young and loves to just get, blank-faced, well, you're much more likely to commit a crime. You're much more likely to destroy your life. That could be something that we could get at. And I see maybe you're not embracing this opinion of mine, and that's totally fine. You're not going to have people on the show that just parrot everything back. But I would say the way we view alcohol in society could be something that could be looked at.
I completely agree with you insofar as I personally love drugs and alcohol. But
I don't think you abused them, for the record. But
I don't think so either. But I will say that to me, it's completely beyond comprehension that there are a lot of ways to alter your consciousness, right? We've got psychedelics, we've got cannabis, we've got, I don't know what you would call DMT. I guess that's hallucinogenic, but whatever. There's lots of ways to alter your consciousness. And in terms of anything you'd want to measure, impact to society, car crashes, personal health impacts, public health impacts, like anything you'd want to measure, alcohol is among the worst. If you look at heroin, right, which is supposed to be the worst drug imaginable, do you know what the long-term impacts of heroin use are?
I do not.
You can burn out the pleasure centers of your brain and constipation. That's it. Now, why do people die? Because they can't get it. They get adulterated supplies. They take more than they realize that they're taking because the purity differs. They get involved in crime because they can't afford it, right? But the heroin itself is way better for you than alcohol by any objective measure. You know how many heroin-associated car crashes there are? You know? So why is alcohol, legal? I'm not... Everything
I know
should
what you
be
mean.
legal.
Yeah.
Why is it celebrated, but heroin is hugely stigmatized?
Yeah, Bud Light's lobbyist really powerful? I mean, I'm serious. I don't know there's probably some explanation for this. I don't know what it is.
Zach, incredible information. You know so much, and you're so good at explaining it in such a way as someone who doesn't know anything can understand. So thank you for that. Thank you for coming on. Let us know who should get in touch with you, how to get in touch with you, when they should get in touch with you. And thanks so much.
Well, thank you, Kathy and Rob. It's been a great pleasure to come back on the podcast. Love listening both during the podcast and to other podcasts as well. Just real quick, if anybody wants to get in touch with me, andersonprotection.com. You can find our email, our phone on there. We have an online form submission if you want to be totally anonymous. If you or someone you love is slipping or needs some help, just give us a call. We'll see what options are there. We talked about some of the tools that the law provides, and if some of those are appropriate, we can help you with that. The mental illness component of homelessness has got to be one of the toughest sub-issues of a very tough issue. You know, the solution to building more housing. Well, I can figure that out. Build more housing. This one is a lot more difficult than that. So just the fact that y'all are willing to tackle it and just try, we didn't solve world hunger today over the past 45 minutes, but the fact that you and your organization are willing to try and talk about it means a lot. And I think that's how you eat an elephant one bite at a time, right?
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank you for tuning in to Housing for Huntsvillians. This podcast is a project of Huntsville New Liberals. Sign up for our newsletter and RSVP to our monthly happy hour at huntsvillenewliberals.com.